hit the subscribe button, and jump right into Frontier Feud, a wild Western action adventure. Chapter 1. He took advantage of the shade and coolness of the bosque to remove his army cap and mop his red, perspiring forehead. Gray cottonwoods and willows, their roots lost in Moscon's sandy banks, made a drab background for the dusty blue of the two men's uniforms. With the mouth of his canteen brushing his flat lips, Sergeant Holt Kane paused to growl, "Looks like you're home, soldier. But you ain't going to be damn fool enough to stay, like you said you was, are you?" The lean, sunburned young cavalry captain kicked his feet out of the stirrups and stretched his long legs, as if trying futilely to work out the stiffness gained by 4 years of fighting in the saddle. "It's not a question of wanting to stay," he replied tersely. "There's the matter of an estate and other things that need nosing into. I don't figure on staying forever, but likely be bunking in Dos Pasos for a month anyway." The gray-haired sergeant wiped his head, frowning at the younger man. "I'll tell you something, Rip," he said. "You ain't going to hit it off here anymore. This is Texas, and you've been 4 years fighting her and the rest of the South. Local boy or not, you're going to be just another damn Yankee in Dos Pasos, and they'll treat you accordingly. It'll take a long time for folks down here to get over licking their wounds and forgetting their hatreds. Have you forgotten what happened in the other Texas towns we've been through the last few months?" Rip Campbell shook his leonine head and loosened his service hat. "I don't reckon I could," he admitted. "It's something new to have women spit at me, and men cuss me out when I walk down a street. But I've lived here all my life. Maybe Dos Pasos'll be different. If not, I'll have to tough it out. Either way, I've got to stay a while. Let's ride on and have a farewell drink before you leave." Holt Kane shrugged and followed him through the shallow stream. Then, side by side, the two men headed their mounts toward town. There seemed to be a chunk of lead in Rip Campbell's slab-muscled chest as they rode toward Dos Pasos. It was more than the dread of homecoming that deepened the lines about his fine mouth and put darker shadows in his gray eyes. He had seen things on the long ride back to the little central Texas town that made him feel older than his 25 years. And the sting of his reception everywhere still burned in him. At Appomattox, 8 months ago, the Civil War had officially ended. But for the South, the shadows of a more cruel strife were gathering, a war that knew no armistice. The savage fangs of depression were already sunk deeply in the vast Texas rangelands. Millions of mavericks, it was said, were running wild throughout the state, wearing no man's brand, and belonging to anyone with the ambition to round them up. The ugly word depression was new to Campbell, but it rang now on all sides. He saw endless brown clouds that were scabby herds of longhorns grazing the land bare. Men were trying to sell for a pittance ranches into which they'd put their lifeblood, and being laughed at. Vast domains, once great, were now deserted and worthless. He'd seen with his own eyes whole towns desperate for food, the women and children in rags ravaged by the dogs of war. He and Kane had strung together in Georgia for the long trek west. All the way they had faced the hatred of these desperate people. They cursed them and their blue uniforms, blamed them for their plight. For while Texas men had been away fighting, kin against kin, friend against friend, the cattle had run wild and become a vast herd of gaunt, dangerous outlaws, fleet as deer, tough as wet leather. A slow anger built up in Rip as they neared Dos Pasos. He'd had his fill now of being called a damned Yankee, a blackguard, of swallowing insults because he pitied and understood the Southerners' feelings. Hell, he was one of them. But because he'd fought for the cause he thought was right, he was a mongrel dog. He promised himself silently as he rode that he had to fight his way back to respect, that the next man who braced him with insults would taste bared knuckles. Late August heat lay thick and sultry over Dos Pasos and the Bosque land. Campbell's coat was open at the throat, and his white shirt gleamed in the sunlight. Sparks kindled on his brass buttons and bright epaulets. Dust lay in the creases of his holster, and the walnut butt of his service pistol was gray with it. He rode regally in his army saddle, a figure to command respect wherever fighting men gathered. But now he knew little but hatred and scorn of a brave but vanquished enemy. A breeze, sharp with the tang of sodden willow leaves, was at his broad back as they rode away from the creek. On their left were small adobe and frame houses, outposts of Dos Pasos. A little farther on, beyond a dusty plaza, the town itself began. A tight huddle of motley buildings that seemed crowded together for protection from a strife-torn world. A frown built on Rip's forehead as he noted a strange contrast between this town and the others they'd passed through. Dos Pasos, strangely, was bustling with activity. Even at a distance, it offered an impression of prosperity and vitality that the young army officer could almost feel. Holt Kane's eyes bugged, and he exploded. "Well, tunnel me with a dum-dum if something ain't wrong here, Duff. Look!" A new, red wagon in front of the mercantile. "You can damn me for a Johnny Reb if I've seen such a sight in 500 miles. Rip was dumbfounded. "Sure enough, and look yonder." He gestured. "There's a woman in a new dress. Looks like Dos Pasos never heard about post-war depressions." They pulled their mounts up to a tie rack, dismounted, and made their way slowly down the street, staring curiously and being stared at in return. They soon discovered that whatever the difference between Dos Pasos' seeming prosperity and the poorness of other towns, it failed to extend to the reception accorded a pair of stray Union soldiers. Women gathered in their skirts at their approach and stood icily aside while they passed, as if they were so much filth. Men either ignored them or formed groups that filled the whole boardwalk, challenging them to pass through. Because it had long since been found to be the wiser course, the two cavalrymen stepped into the dusty street and went around the sullen knots of hot-eyed men. They saw hostility on every side, and Rip, more than ever, dreaded the prospect of remaining long here. "By Harry, something's got into this burg," Holt Kane muttered. "I can't put a finger on it, but it's here. You'd think cattle was booming and business rushing, the way people are buying and selling. And you'd think Union skunks have sense to stay out of a man's town, mister." A man's voice, dripping with hatred, drawled just behind them. Rip stiffened and spun to face the speaker. Anger stained the high bones of his leathery cheeks. Kane's hand took him by the shoulder. "Easy, Duff," he said tersely. "Let him have his fun." But Rip's hackles were up. He thrust Holt's hand from him ungently, stared at the man who had spoken. The fellow was big in a slumped, slack-muscled way, and stood just in front of a small group of men, which had apparently just stepped from a saloon. Hard whiskey gave his face a flaming ruddiness. His heavy lips drooped in a sneer. All Rip's pent-up anger and resentment seemed to explode within him. "If this is a white man's town," he bit out, "I'd like to know what you're doing here, fella. They've got to draw the line somewhere, but for a Georgia swamp rat, you must have come out of a hole without them seeing." The beefy man's face drained of all color as he thrust his spade chin at the cavalryman. His foul breath struck at Rip's nostrils. "You'll get down and lick my boots for that, sir," he grated. "Starting right now. You hear me?" "I hear you," Rip gave back, "but it ain't scaring me none." "Then maybe this will." The lazy muscles of the puncher went into action. His big right fist stabbed out like a pile driver. Rip's motions were so quick that the onlookers had no time to analyze them. His legs bent slightly, and the puncher's fist whistled over his head. Then the army man brought one up from the sidewalk, and 4 hard knuckles smashed the side of the man's jaw. His head shot back, and he caromed off a puncheon supporting the saloon awning to crash on his back in the street. He lay there stunned for a moment. Blood dribbling from a cut Rip's punch had opened along his spade chin. Then he was shaking the cobwebs from his brain and scrambling up, his face savage with the lust to kill. His right hand streaked gunward. "You damned Yankee trash," he bellowed. "You won't lay hand on another Texas man." Rip saw he had no chance of stopping gunplay with fists. He condemned himself for using knuckles instead of matching draws. But it was too late now. Lunging to one side, he tugged at his big Navy pistol. The man was way ahead on the snatch, and his gun cleared first. But Rip's quick leap aside combined with liquor and brain fog to make the other miss. A window crashed behind Campbell as he leapt forward. The long barrel of the Navy pistol arced down and clipped the side of the puncher's head. With a deep grunt, the man sagged, recovered himself, and in blind rage lifted his gun again. Hating to kill the cowpoke, thus earning himself new enemies, the cavalryman lunged aside and in. Again his gun barrel struck, biting through the other's range hat and into hair and scalp. The man caved as if poleaxed. Swiftly Rip whirled, gun ready to face the others. "You can all just stay like that," he bit out tightly. "Halt, go get the marshal. We'll get this down on the books right, in case anything comes of it." Kane, swearing softly at the bad turn of luck, hurried off. He did not have to go far. A tall, thin man came running down the boardwalk towards him. A gun flashed in his hand as he ran. Sunlight glinted on the shield on his vest. Meanwhile, Rip's attention had been taken by a powerful, square-built man on the saloon steps. The man's wide-brimmed hat was back off his face, letting thick brown hair protrude. He was grinning at Campbell. "You've got what it takes, mister," he said. "Even if you did curry the burrs out of the tail of one of my toughest cowhands showing it." Rip grinned back. "No harm meant," he said. "It was a case of eat or get et." The marshal, a businesslike lawman with a thin face and small, serious eyes, supervised the moving of the unconscious puncher's limp form. Rip learned the lawman's name was Hank Leffie. The drunken puncher was Lon Harbold. A crowd was collecting, and through it all, Rip and Kane were conscious of the heat of scores of hostile eyes. Leffie kept the spectators back from the wounded man. "Get the doctor, one of you," he grunted. Turning to Rip, he demanded, "Well, what's your story, young feller? I warn you, this looks mighty bad." "I'll call on these gents," Rip said, indicating the group that had watched the fracas, "to bear me out in my story. Harbold tackled me and got off a shot before I knew what he was at. I slugged him twice because he made me." Leffie's gaze swung to the loungers. "How about that?" One of them shrugged. "That ain't exactly how I seen it. Looked like him and Lon was arguing about something before the fight. They both went for their guns at the same time." A hot retort surged to the cavalryman's lips, but the tall man by the batwings halted him. "Sam's got it a little twisted," he drawled. "The stranger told it right, Marshal. It don't look like he was at fault, to me." Rip did not fail to note the quick respect that greeted his words. Leffie grunted. "Your word's good enough for me, McLeod. We'll put it on the books that way, in case Harbold's bad hurt." Rip grinned his thanks at McLeod, and just then the doctor came up. A girl, flushed, and with her hair looking considerably wind-blown, accompanied him. The Union man felt the scornful glance she drove at him as the surgeon went to work on the still unconscious man. Contempt flared in her deep blue eyes. Presently, the doctor snapped his bag shut. "Hurt bad," he informed them. "Skull fracture, and I think a serious concussion." "Mule kick him?" McLeod moved in. "Yeah, an army mule," he grinned. "Take him to the hotel, and do what you can for him, Doc. Put it on my bill. Harbold's one of my men." With surprising abruptness, the girl's face swung to Rip's. "Won't you Northerners ever stop spreading grief?" she flared. "Carpetbaggers, spies, scavengers, you've caused as much trouble since the war as during it." Holt Kane was tugging at Rip's arm again, but the younger man brushed him off. Kane's face was red and sweating. Discomfort was written all over him. "Miss," Rip snapped, "I happen to be a Texan myself. That didn't prevent me from having the courage of my convictions." But the fact that I'm wearing a U.S. uniform doesn't mean I'm on the peck for trouble. The marshal will tell you who's to blame here." The girl favored him with a bitter look. "A Union man is never wrong, is he? Not when he's wielding the whip, it seems." Haughtily, she turned away. Rip's cheeks grew hot. He stifled his rising anger, turned brusquely to Marshal Leffie. "I'll be in town a spell if you want me again," he informed him. "You'll find me at the hotel, too. That ought to make it convenient, cause and effect in the same spot." Sergeant Holt Kane was limp with perspiration when they left. "God almighty, kid," he husked. "Are you trying to start another war? Let's get the hell out of this burg." "You get out, Holt," Rip smiled. "I'm staying on. Not that I wouldn't give a lot to be able to leave with you." The middle-aged cavalryman replaced his cap and wagged his head. "Well, it's your funeral," he decided. I ain't in a mood to stick around and argue the point. I'm heading for New Mexico, to a spot near one of the reservations, to raise beef and forget there ever was a war." "You could do a lot worse," Rip told him. "Maybe so. I'll be up there, cutting sign on you before long." "If you live long enough," Kane amended. "You're making your bed in cactus for sure. You'll bust your heart trying to soften these Texan sons o' guns, and you won't never succeed. When that happens, kid, remember, you was warned." "I'll remember," Rip said, and he watched Kane hurry down the street. Chapter 2. On a back street at the far end of town, Rip stopped before a slatternly adobe house behind a crooked picket fence. This was home. Home. The word had the empty ring of a false coin. He'd run away from this house 4 years ago, away from the dad he loved and the stepmother he hated. Guilt stung Rip's conscience as he remembered sneaking off without even leaving a note to his father. But any word at all would have annulled the purpose of his leaving. He prayed Sam Campbell had never learned the reason for his son's disappearance. That would have killed him, just as surely as malaria had actually stricken him down. Through the screen door, he could see into the cool duskiness of the house. At his knock, someone moved and a man grunted, "The door, Beth." At the sound of that voice, Rip Campbell's face went wooden. Blood surged hotly through his temples. Slowly, he took off his dusty cap as a woman's figure materialized back of the screen. He was looking at a woman of perhaps 33, short and rather dowdy, with stringy blonde hair gathered into a knot at the back of her neck. Recognition suddenly came into the woman's eyes, recognition and fear. "Well, the prodigal son returned," she said nervously. "What do you want here, Rip? I suppose you know your dad's dead." "Yeah, I heard of it," Rip told her. His eyes strayed past his stepmother into the living room, searching the gloom for the owner of the other voice. Beth Campbell's pale hazel eyes pinched. She moved as if to obstruct his view. "Well then, what do you want here?" she demanded. "I sent all your belongings down to the courthouse, case you want them." As the poor light ceased to hamper Rip's vision, he eased the door open and moved inside. "No, that isn't what I want," he said with a hard grin. "I want some words with this polecat friend of yours, Dos Cayley." The heavy-set, baldish man on the sofa came ponderously to his feet, nervousness visible in the working of his jaw. The little purple threads webbing his cheeks darkened. "Well, well," he croaked. "Glad to see you, boy." "I'll bet you are," Rip gritted, advancing on the hesitating Cayley. "I'll bet you're about as glad as you were when I caught you with my dad's wife 4 years ago." "Rip, you got this all wrong," Cayley interposed. "You're going off, half-cocked." "Me and Beth." Rip Campbell gathered up a handful of Cayley's shirt front. "When the cat's away, the rats hold a circus, he mocked him. "But the cat's back, mister. And what you're going to get will be no circus. I warned you never to come in my dad's house again." Beth Campbell screamed as the tall cavalryman's fist drew back. "Rip," she screamed. "You fool. Leave him," Her last words were choked into a gasp as Rip's fist chopped Kaylee's lips against his heavy teeth. Kaylee went down, came up with flailing fists and a curse on his lips. Rip Campbell met his rush with neat feints and blocking fists. He put a lean, light arm's power into the next haymaker, and Kaylee went backward over the sofa. Rip was right after him, teeth shining in a wicked grin. This was something he'd longed for during those 4 years of hell and loneliness. For Dawson, Kaylee had given him a round lacing the day he ran away from Dos Pasos, and Rip had been saving him a like one ever since. Young Rip had tried to shut his ears to the gossip about Kaylee and Beth, his dad's new wife, that started less than a year after Sam had remarried. He kept his father's admonition always before him. You got to love and honor your stepmother just like she was your real ma. You and me and her will get along fine, if you remember that, and do like she asks in the little things that are important to a woman. It'll please her, son, and me. He'd said that sincerely, and just as sincerely, Rip had promised to try his best. Sam was too old for Beth, of course. But he was lonely, and she said she loved him. But when Rip caught them in each other's arms, he forgot what Sam had said. He wailed into Kaylee. The lawyer, Sam Campbell's only legal rival in town, was a lot bigger and heavier than the boy, and the thrashing he gave him wasn't forgotten for a long time. When Rip came to, his one-track, boyishly idealistic mind saw only one thing to do, and that was leave home. He couldn't hurt his dad by telling him about Beth. Better that he should think his son was an ungrateful whelp than break his heart over her. But it was a shock when he learned that Sam had died, leaving him no chance ever to explain. These dark thoughts were in Rip's mind now, as he jabbed savagely at Kaylee's reddening features. Beth kept screeching in his ear, and Kaylee tried to talk with him too, but Rip's blood was hot and he heard nothing. Kaylee grunted as Rip's fist probed his lax belly. Instantly, he was reeling from a blow over the eye. The orb went red and swelled shut. With a grunt, he tucked his baldish head and rushed. Campbell swayed aside. His fist slammed into the side of Kaylee's head. Pivoting fast, he brought him around with another blow, and then slashed wickedly into his bloody face. The lawyer staggered back. A final punch over the heart seemed to unhinge his knees. On all fours, he wagged his head stupidly, making no effort to get up. Rip swept up the man's coat and hat from the davenport. With one hand, he planted Kaylee on his feet. Jamming the hat over his head, he forced the coat into his hands and shoved him toward the door. That makes us about one up, mister, he breathed heavily. Now you get the hell out of here and stay out. I might lose my temper next time. He was watching the lawyer's unsteady advance up the street when Beth recalled him. She was standing with clenched fists in the middle of the room. You fool, she hissed. Oh, you brainless young fool. My name isn't Beth Campbell anymore. It's Beth Kaylee. We've been married for 1.5 years. Rip took his eyes away from Kaylee with a jerk. He said, my God. The exclamation summed up Rip's complete surprise. It also summed up his amazement that any woman could see herself married to a man like Dawson Kaylee. You married to him, he fumbled. You didn't lose much time, did you? What I did is none of your business, she snapped, striking a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Daws'll make you pay for this. He's got more rights here than you have now. He's my husband, and this is my house. Resentment erased a little of Rip Campbell's mortification. Somehow, he knew a deep satisfaction that this woman no longer bore the same name as he. But her remark had led into the matter that brought him back here to Dos Pasos. That's just what I came to see about, he told her quietly. Dad must have left a will. If you think you're going to get what's rightly mine, you've got another thought coming. Beth snapped. This house, don't get excited, Rip advised her. It's not money or property that brings me back. If Dad left a will, He must have left some sort of instructions for me. A letter or something. Well, he didn't. He never mentioned you after you left. Rip idly cuffed dust from his cap. That's too bad. In that case, I'll have to go down to the courthouse and see just what's what. Dad was too good a lawyer to die intestate. And if I find, for instance, that he left me this house, you're going to find yourself outside or renting from me. If you want to produce that will, of course. Beth Cayley's thin lips formed a tight white line. Then her hands made a defeated, aimless motion. You're a fox like your father was, ain't you? She sniffed. He never was one to do things out in the open and above board. Not him. Always scheming and planning behind. Let's see that will, Rip snapped. He was sick of this house, sick of Beth, soul sick with the memories it brought into his head. Beth knew she was beaten. She flounced off and rattled around in drawers in a back room. Then she was back with some worn, greasy documents. She flung them at him. There. She tossed her head. And don't forget your promise. Rip sat down. He opened the will first and found it drawn up neatly, in the flawless order Sam Campbell had considered so important in life. He was not particularly surprised to see the following. To my wife, Beth Smith Campbell, I leave the sum of $1, and stipulate that said bequest shall be withdrawn if she contests this will. All other property, real and personal, I leave to my son, Duffield Campbell. It was about what Rip had expected. There was a letter, too, and Rip read it through with growing hatred for Cayley and Beth. My dear son, I know now why you left home, and I respect you for what you tried to do for me. But it had to come, and I'm not blaming Beth too much. There's a wide bridge between the old and the young, and I ain't young anymore. I've got only one thing to ask of you, Rip, that you should carry on my law work where I'm leaving off. I've schooled you in law since you were knee-high to a brief. You'll get by. These country people need legal help, sometimes worse than they need a doctor. I'm leaving you all my books and papers. You know as much about law as you need to set up practice. What more you lack, you'll get by hard knocks. There was more, but Rip knew already that the big thing in the letter was that request, knew that his future had been warped by those neat lines of feathery writing. The fluid notions as to his future had set like cement. He owed it to his father's memory to make at least a stab at being a lawyer. His eyes grew hot with tears barely held back as he scanned the missive. To break his morbid mood, Rip crammed the paper in his pocket and strode to his father's office. He found it dusty, uncared for. But right now his thoughts were for the secret compartment, where he and Sam used to keep things that were meant for other eyes. Sam would keep money there when he didn't have time to take it to the bank. It was a hole in the middle of the fireplace, hidden by a wedge-shaped keystone. The smoke-blackened rock would slide easily out of place. Rip's long fingers went to tugging at the brick. It came away, showering white mortar on the floor. His hands shook a little as he peered into the dark recess. There was money there, all right, sheaves of yellowbacks, bags of specie. Chapter 3. A light step behind him caused him to pivot swiftly. Beth was staring, her thin white features sharp as frost. Then there was money, she gasped. And it's part of mine, Rip Campbell. Is it now? He queried, politely. Beth's tongue dabbed at her lips. Sam said if ever I needed money, you was to help me, she lied. Let's have an understanding, Rip rasped. I'm sticking by that will. Fight it, if you don't like it. Khalid be just the man for the case. While Beth stood by, furious, he counted the money and found $23,000. It took his breath away. $23,000 was a fortune these times. A little dizzy, he began stuffing his pockets. But as he tried to brush past Beth, she seized his arm. Rip, she pleaded. If I just had a couple of hundred. Everybody that has a cent is buying up that gilt-edged stock. I could. Rip frowned. What stock? St. Louis Southwestern Railroad, of course. Vance McLeod says $100 worth of stock will be worth $2,000 in a year or so. McLeod's their agent down here. With $300, say, for 3 shares. For the first time, Rip began to understand Dos Pasos' air of prosperity. He wondered if McLeod was the smiling, well-built man who had taken his part before Marshal Leffie. How is anybody getting the money to buy stock in this kind of a country? He demanded. Texas cattle aren't worth the money for cartridges to slaughter them. Beth's thin shoulders shrugged. Oh, mortgaging their land and stock for what they can get, I suppose, she offered. McLeod says when the road gets through to Fort Worth, they'll be able to drive their herds there and sell them for almost what they get in Chicago. I haven't heard of any railroad during my wanderings, Rip argued. Fort Worth wasn't much head up about it when I went through. How do you know it isn't a skin game? Beth was horrified. Don't be silly. McLeod was born and raised in this country. Fought for Lee too, she put in acidly. He's got nothing but our best interests at heart. He says Dos Pasos is the kind of cattle range that's going to be the backbone of Texas one of these days, soon as we get a market for our beef. Rip, if you could even just loan me that $300. Rip was full to the gills of her whining. So weary, indeed, that he peeled off 3-century notes and shoved them into her bony fingers. There's your gilt-edged stock, he grunted. May you run it up to 6,000. There'll be a man down later for my books and desk. With her thanks jarring on his ears, he left the house. He dumped the money into his saddlebags and headed for the bank. The Lone Star Trust and Savings looked like a cattleman's bank in boom times, Rip was thinking as he entered. Conversation and cigar smoke filled the big room. Half a dozen men were talking with an official in back. 2 clerks were at the wickets. Rip deposited his weighty bags on the counter with a sullen clank. Like to start an account, he told the teller. The man's eyes fastened on the bags with interest. About how much? He queried. Looks like you're freighting quite a load there, mister. 20,000, the cavalryman told him easily. Maybe I'll put half of that in a checking account. The clerk cleared his throat, glancing back nervously towards the rear. Then he reached for the cage latch. I'll have Mr. Parker take care of you, he faltered. Will you wait a minute? Rip watched him hurry away. A short, solidly built man, in a pinstripe black suit, glanced up hurriedly at the words the teller murmured in his ear. Suddenly, the whole room was conscious of Rip Campbell's presence. There was that awkward tension that grows from the presence of a stranger whose status is in doubt. Rip knew that every eye was on his uniform. He felt the heat of their scornful glances. Only one man disguised his contempt, and that was Parker, the bank owner. He had a smile on his lips when he approached the window. Undersized and swarthy, he wore a look of prosperity. Natty pinstripe suit and shiny yellow shoes were matched by smooth-shaven skin and carefully groomed hands. He offered Rip his grip. Farley Parker, he introduced himself. You aren't the Rip Campbell who left here 5 years ago. The same. The depression doesn't seem to have touched you much, Parker. Things seem to be moving in Dos Pasos. Parker shrugged, and his eyes seemed to appraise the entire room. We can't complain, he said. And as his glance touched the saddlebags, you appear to have done all right by yourself, Rip. How much was it you wanted to deposit? 20,000. How much interest do you pay? Parker did not entirely hide his breathlessness at the figure mentioned. He reached for a deposit slip, pen and ink. 6.5%, he stated. More than any other bank in Texas is paying. You aren't making a wrong move, mister. Suspicion tapped Rip on the shoulder. His eyes were narrow. You, I suppose you invest fairly heavily in this St. Louis Southwestern Railroad stock. Farley Parker's eyes met his, soberly. We're backing it to the limit. You won't find a more solid security in the country today. St. Louis Southwestern is going to be the making of this country, and we've got confidence in the men who represent it. Vance McLeod assures me he'll be paying first-rate dividends after the first of the month. I intend to pass those dividends on to my depositors in the form of increased interest. Rip hooked his arm through the saddlebags, swept them from the counter. I'm afraid you won't be passing them on to me then, he said. I'll take my gilt-edged stock with a smaller percentage of brass. Far as I know, this railroad outfit hasn't laid a tie or driven a spike. Sorry, Parker, it's no go. Parker blinked, stunned. In the back of the room, there was an angry muttering. Someone swore under his breath. The damned, bull-headed Yankee. Anger drained the color from the banker's swart face. His black eyes snapped fiery sparks as he laid the pen down. That kind of talk will buy you a lot of unpopularity in this town, Campbell. St. Louis Southwestern is sound, that point is certain. You're taking sides against the force that is saving Dos Pasos from the ruin that faces all the rest of Texas. We're buying new stock, new land, replacing worn-out equipment with money we can thank the railroad for. Just how much new cash, Rip snorted, has come to this town from the railroad? Isn't it true that Dos Pasos is doing all its buying on money your bank has loaned on stock and land? That's true. But the facts don't tell the whole story. Within a few months, we'll be getting dividends. Then these loans can be paid off, and if the ranchers wish, new issues of stock can be bought up. If the ranchers aren't foreclosed first, Rip pointed out. In the rear, two men came angrily to their feet and started forward. Parker stopped their advance with a raised hand. We won't argue about it, Campbell, he snapped. But a lot of folks are going to take it unkindly if you hand them this kind of talk. I don't know as I want your business now or in the future. Good day. Smiling a little, Rip slung the leather pouches over his shoulder. No hard feelings, he offered. But any time you unload your St. Louis Southwestern for something reliable, I'll be around with my business. I gather you don't have a great deal of faith in my company, a man said at Rip's back. What have you heard, Captain? Rip felt the hackles on his neck crawl. He came about swiftly, to stare into the confident face of the man whose herd he had beaten. Vance McLeod possessed in his person and voice the force of a powerful, calculating fighter. His pearl-gray Stetson cast its shadow over the coldest pair of steel-blue eyes Rip Campbell had ever looked into. Despite the remarks he could not have failed to hear the army man make, he kept a smile under his dark mustache and an easy drawl to his voice. Nothing personally, McLeod. But I'll choose a bank that invests in good, sound government securities every time. As far as I know, your outfit hasn't proved up yet. McLeod bit the end off a crooked Italian cigar, spat the black burl outside. As far as you know, he quoted. Captain, I wouldn't talk so loose about something I didn't understand. St. Louis Southwestern will be paying 4% on all the stock I've sold very shortly. Why don't you climb on the bandwagon before the price begins to skyrocket? Rip had to smile at his brash confidence, turning what could have been a heated argument into a sales talk. Nada. Campbell wagged his head. Every time I see a skyrocket, I keep wondering how it feels to come down. When your road pulls into Fort Worth, maybe so I'll climb aboard. But let me ask you a question, McLeod. The railroad man toyed with the cigar. Go ahead, he said levelly. Rip was conscious that every man in the bank was straining to hear. He knew also that behind his affability, the railroad man's temper was drawn to a feather edge. There was cold hatred in those pale blue eyes. You talk, Campbell said, about faith in Dos Pasos and the Bosque country. about this section being the backbone of the Texas cattle industry someday. Well, I'm curious. But how much faith do you yourself have in it? How much of your own money is going into land and cattle? McLeod glanced at the others. Ride out and take a look at the Big M Ranch someday, Captain, he said quietly. Better take your lunch and supper along too. Most of the best grazing land in the Bosque is in my name. Plenty of high-grade cow stuff is tattooed with my brand too. You might as well get it through your head now that Vance McLeod and this range are as good as riveted together. The onlookers were laughing, Parker the loudest of all. Rip's ears burned, but he had the impression that McLeod's words told only half the story. I'll still take government bonds. He shook his head. Better get yourself a few, mister. See you around. The agent tipped his hat in mock courtesy. Then he was calling after the lawyer. A word of advice, Captain. Shuck those pretty clothes for some civilized duds. The war's over, you know. And down here, the ladies don't particularly care for blue uniforms. Parker and the others roared. When their laughter quieted, Rip was smiling down from his horse, his words for all of them. Don't be too sure about the war being over. A lot of men, who've invested on the spur of the moment, may find the battle's just beginning. Chapter 4. Through the heat of the late afternoon, Rip rode down to the hotel. He got a room on the street to take advantage of the evening shade. With a shave, his first in 3 days, and a bath, he began to feel a little more respectable. Once again, his thoughts went to the money Sam had left him. A great sense of relief poured through him that he hadn't banked it at the Lone Star. Sam Campbell, he recalled, had never trusted Farley Parker. Undoubtedly, that was why he had preferred a hole in the wall to his prosperous bank. And that was saying a lot, with Beth snooping around. Rip let his thoughts dwell on Vance McLeod for a while. The smoke of suspicion clouded his mind every time he considered him and his St. Louis Southwestern Railroad. He felt sure there was no such outfit actually building a road anywhere. He considered McLeod no more than a confidence man of a high caliber. But McLeod was sinking his own money in Texas land and beef. That was incredible to Rip. Texas land was worth practically nothing in a bottomless market. Beef, well, you could buy a longhorn anywhere for the price of a day's wages for the man who roped him off the range for you. Blooded stock was a little different, even in these times. A good Brahma or Hereford was still worth raising, he guessed. Bosque land, too, should be worth something, if a man had the guts and money to hang onto it for a few years. Rip gave it up and turned his thoughts to his own affairs. There was the matter of getting out some handbills, advertising his intention to continue in his dad's profession. He'd spotted an empty land office down street where he figured to move in. One more thing bothered him. Das Cayley. With a sour grimace, Rip decided he owed the man some kind of an apology. After all, he'd been within his rights this time. Leaving his money in the hotel safe, the cavalryman went out into the glare of the street. When there is any money at all floating around, saloons can be figured to do a fair business. It was so with the Bull's Head when Rip pushed into the place and searched the crowd for Dawson Cayley. There was a score of patrons in the saloon. Yet within 5 seconds, it seemed word got around that there was a Union man present. Glasses were lowered to the bar, while the drinkers stared with undisguised hostility. Some men playing pool near the door stood holding their cues stiffly. Rip located Cayley near the middle of the bar. He trailed his sunflower spurs through the sawdust and stopped beside him. A couple of surly-looking punchers, with whom Cayley had apparently been drinking, moved away. Before Rip could speak to the lawyer, one of them began humming a parody on a northern marching song, a burlesque calculated to start a fight anywhere. But Rip kept his temper. "I figure I owe you an apology, Kaylee," he said quietly. "Beth tells me you two are married now. I'm sorry I went off half-cocked like that." Kaylee's bruised, purpling features soured. "You will be if you aren't now," he growled. "I ain't forgetting that, Campbell. Now that you've said your piece, you'd better drag yourself out of here. You ain't exactly the fair-haired boy with us. If that's how you like it. I hardly expected you to accept my invitation to forget our grudge in a drink." The big, red-headed cowboy was bawling the words to the song now. He had his hat shoved back from freckled, sunburnt features, and his jaw worked loosely as he sang. Rip refused the bait as he moved past. And then, in the mirror, he saw Kaylee nod slightly. In the same instant, the puncher arrested Rip with a big paw. "You got your guts trying to drink with white men," he sneered. Rip struck his hand down. "You'll eat those words or wish you had," he breathed, his face white. "Damned if he ain't declaring himself," the red-headed one laughed. Cat swift, he swept his drink from the bar straight into Rip's face. In the same blur of motion, he went for his gun. Rip's head went down, and the drink spattered against his blue cap. He caught the puncher's hand at the wrist and held the gun in its holster. His light hand made a short, chopping motion that broke the man's nose. Bawling with pain, Red tore away. "Get the damn skunk, boys," he yelled. "Kill him." Rip stopped his shout with a blow to the belly that doubled him up. Then he piled 2 wicked punches into his face and saw him go down dazed and bleeding. The man's partner came at him with a rush, gun held high for a buffalo blow. Like a cracked whip, Rip Campbell's lean body lashed forward. The gun barrel found only the epaulette on his coat. Then his own Colt was out. He whipped the stocky, blonde puncher across the eyes with it. Blood gushed, and the man screamed with pain. But others were piling in on the lone army man. Bottles flashed, and the men who had been playing pool ran forward with broken-off cues. Even the bartender was reaching for a bung starter. Rip dared not level his Colts. The slightest excuse would bring a hail of lead in his direction. He hot-led the blonde cowboy into the face of the onrushing attackers and flung an empty beer glass after him. Suddenly, lights exploded in his head as the bartender brought the bung starter down in a glancing blow. Rip had to hook one elbow over the bar to remain erect. He fought for consciousness. It was no guess that if he went down, the irate cowman would beat him so terribly his face would never look the same. Another puncher came in low, and Rip was able to sidestep him and knock him to the floor with a blow to the back of the neck. Then they were on him with savage yells. A fist bloomed up before his eyes and sent him against the bar, dazed. But even as he went down under them, he heard a gun roar and a shrill voice puncture the fight sounds. "Stand back, you mangy he-wolves. You're a disgrace to yourselves and the army you fought with." Chapter 5. Rip, from his spot in the sawdust, made out the saddle-warped form of a man standing atop the bar, a sharps in his hands. Short and grizzled though he was, his gun had an immediate effect on the crowd. They melted away from Rip like boys caught tormenting a stray dog. The 2 Rip had felled lay where they had sprawled. The cavalryman dragged himself to his feet with spinning head. The old-timer spat tobacco juice at the feet of the mob. 20-1, he sneered. "Even a Union man rates better odds than that. Maybe his breed did outnumber us at Gettysburg, but that was war. Won't you damned hyenas never learn that the war's over? Kaylee, you fight terrific when you can skulk in and strike from the back. But I never seen you at Gettysburg, on the firm line." Kaylee muttered something. But Rip was staring curiously at his benefactor. He was short, not over 5'5", and a blackened printer's apron hung down to his knees. A booted foot and a thick pine stump showed below that. Ink smudges were on his face and his steel-rimmed spectacles. There was a liberal quantity of ink, too, in the stringy mustaches that pronged down from a bulbous red nose. With a surge of pleasure, Rip remembered him. "Sarge," he jerked. "Old Sarge Baylor." A couple of Confederate medals flashed as the printer twisted to wink at him. "Right you are, my misguided young friend," he admitted. "Come on down here, where you can light out fast when I turn these mad dogs loose. I still ain't guaranteed you nothin'. Liquor and politics make an unreliable mixture." Rip picked up his gun and moved to the front. The old printer hopped down behind the bar, and keeping the crowd under his ponderous rifle, took 2-quart bottles of whiskey from the shelves. He snapped a wicked look as the bartender swore. "Shut up, Herb," he advised the muttering barman. "One of these is for what you owe me on last month's printin' bill. The other'n's by way of medicine for the damage you done this yunker with your damn bung starter. Now you all just stand like you are. If airy man pokes his head out the batwings for 5 minutes, I'll scatter brains from here to the plaza." Rip grinned as he backed out. He knew, from where Kaylee's crowd was standing, the .45 to 90 looked a lot less funny. But not until the pair of them were striding down the boardwalk did he feel easy. "When was I so glad to see anybody?" he sighed. "Last time I laid eyes on you, Sarge, was over gun sights at Bull Run." Baylor stopped at the door of his print shop and stumped in. "Hell, was you there too?" he grunted. "I left my right leg behind in that'n. But a peg leg's got its advantage." He laid gun and bottles on the counter and hoisted himself to a seat. Then he twisted at his peg leg until the wooden dowel came out. From the inside of it, he drew an empty glass flask. Yanking the cork from one of the bottles with his teeth, he took a deep drag. Then he filled the empty flask and replaced the peg in its socket. Rip chuckled at his actions. Old Sarge sat there nursing his bottle a moment, his lips pursed as he studied the younger man. In former days, Rip and the old-timer had been great pals. Sam Campbell had all his printing work done here, and the greatest treat in the world for Rip was to be allowed to help set type on it. "Best thing in the world you could do for yourself," old Sarge growled at last, "is to get rid of that uniform. Lucky my press wasn't going, or I wouldn't never have heard the ruckus." "You're the second man that's told me that today," Rip mused. "I haven't been out of service long enough to buy myself some civilized duds. But I'll do it pronto. In a country of bulls like this, I don't fancy myself as a red flag." Sarge had set fire to his blackened clay pipe. "Next time you feel like adventure, don't go messing with McLeod's outfit. Das Cayley's his lawyer." "Yeah." Rip was not too surprised. "Well, they're two of a kind, if you ask me." "I didn't ask you," Sarge said levelly, "but you said yourself a mouthful. They say Vance McLeod's God's gift to Dos Pasos. I say this town full of suckers is hell's gift to Vance McLeod. You couldn't trade me a share of his stock for a second-hand cud of chawn tobacco." "That's what I told McLeod." "You told?" Sarge swallowed. He began to talk quietly, tensely, driving home his points with stabs of the wet pipe stem. "Your daddy used to have a saying that one fox has a better chance against a dozen grizzlies than one grizzly has. That's the spot you're in, if you aim to buck St. Louis from hell southwestern. We had a killing here 2 months ago. Luke Tyler began blowing off against McLeod for being a con man. Just after that, a drunken puncher shot him and left town in a hurry. I ain't saying McLeod paid that puncher off. But if you figure to spout like Tyler did, don't do it. Be smart like a fox, not loud like a grizzly. You'll find it's healthier." "I don't think McLeod's so big," Rip grunted. "Just flashy and smart. He's got everybody in town believing in him, hasn't he?" "Just about. And he's bought up land and cattle until he's the biggest cattleman of them all. Only other one his size or near is Dan Worth. But Worth's stock's lousy himself, so I don't figure he'll last." Rip's brow furrowed. Dan Worth. The name's familiar. Was he in Nestor hereabouts when I left? Not him. He came here after the war, with a bag of money to invest, and a body shot to hell by 2 years in a Yankee prison camp. He's got a lot of his health back, but McLeod's got his money. Rip shrugged. He was beginning to weary, even of the sound of Vance McLeod's name. The whole thing disgusted and vaguely worried him. Well, McLeod's the town's worry, not mine, he decided. I'm going to have plenty of grief of my own. I'm going to carry on Dad's business, Sarge. Sarge's eyes twinkled pale blue behind his square spectacles. Good, he said. Dos Pasos needs a first-rate lawyer. I'll need some handbills and an ad in your paper. Just something plain, like you used to print for Dad. Sarge took off his glasses and fooled with the inky lenses. I get you. It'll seem good to have a Campbell on the books again. Luck to you, boy. Rip Campbell knew, as he made his way down the street through a sea of angry eyes, that he would need all the luck Sarge could wish him. Chapter 6. That afternoon saw Rip attired in dark trousers tucked into old boots, a lightweight shirt under a buckskin vest. He topped the outfit with an expensive fawn-colored Stetson. The next morning, in his newly rented office across the plaza, he prepared for a long wait. It was hard to count on any business for many weeks to come. But before noon, his first customer rode up and dismounted outside his door. In one glance, Rip knew her for the brown-haired, blue-eyed girl who had scorned him before the crowd the day before. She came in briskly, bringing an odor of blue sage that told she had come up from the flats. She was wearing the same, hard-used leather riding skirt and a fresh white blouse. She drew off fringed gauntlets as she entered. Suddenly she saw him, and her face blanched. "You're Rip Campbell," she faltered. "I had no idea." There was a lazy, deep South twang to her voice that Rip remembered. "Sorry to disappoint you, ma'am." He grinned a little sheepishly. "Best I can do, I guess, is to send you to Dos Pasos' other lawyer, Dawson Cayley." The girl frowned impatiently. "No, he won't do it all," she said flatly. Then shrugging, "I suppose I can forget you're a union man if you'll forget my home was Tennessee. After all, this is strictly business." "Strictly, ma'am," Rip said soberly. He found a certain satisfaction in knowing that the girl was still a little abashed by running into him so unexpectedly. "I've come at my father's request," she told him. "I'm Leona Worth. Father saw your advertisement in the Herald and asked me to bring you out to see him. We have the Fencepost Ranch, you know." A shade of resentment hit Rip. These ranchers would be a long time getting over the habit of asking outlandish favors. The Fencepost spread was a good 10 miles down the bosque. "Can't your father come in?" he asked. "I hardly feel like leaving the office for the whole day. Father isn't able to ride. The trip costs him a lot in strength every time he makes it. If you could." Rip felt his ears growing hot. He recalled now old Sarge's statement that Dan Worth's health had been broken in a northern prison. "Of course," he said. "Give me 2 minutes, and I'll be with you." On the long ride down the valley, Leona Worth did not offer any clue as to the nature of the business that necessitated a lawyer's services. But Rip found her a pleasant companion. She talked easily and well of life in the hills of Tennessee, and yet somehow she seemed to fit here. Her calm, dark eyes could catch to so swiftly it took a man's breath away. When they rode up, Dan Worth was lying on a rawhide cot in the shade of some live oaks that sheltered his ranch house. Sunlight, spearing through the leaves above him, struck silver glints from his thick white hair. And even at a distance, Rip saw something that made him catch his breath. Worth had only one arm. There had been a one-armed infantry major at. Worth was on his feet, leaning heavily on a manzanita wood cane. His wedge-shaped head, held high, surmounted a ramrod-straight body. He still wore the butternut trousers of a Southern fighting man. His hand was out to the lawyer, But the wind was never completed. For suddenly recollection sprang into his vital blue eyes. Color leapt into his thin cheeks. "Campbell," he gasped. "By the gods, I thought that name was familiar. Leona, do you know who this man is? This is the Captain Campbell who took my battalion, whole, to a prison for 2 years." Confusion played havoc with Rip's tongue. Words would not come. For he was remembering the valiant Southerner, who had fallen, wounded, among his plucky rifles, at the bloodiest battle of the war. He himself had been responsible for sending Worth to prison. Leona's cheeks had drained of all color. Her gauntlets lay at her feet where they fell. Worth's spike-shaped Van Dyke trembled. "So you are the young firebrand that massacred my troops. 2 finest men ever to come out of the South." "If you will recollect, sir," Rip reminded, "you were trying to do the same." Worth shook his cane under the cavalryman's nose. "And if you will recollect, you damn near did it," he roared. "Get off my land, Campbell. Get off. You aren't worthy to." "Father." Leona Worth stamped her foot. "Remember, you sent for him. It's unfortunate, but it needn't go any further." Rip replaced his hat. "It's all right," he said. "I'm sure I understand your father's position. Nothing hurt me more than to have to help kill courageous men like those he commanded. Good day." Worth was calling him back before he had gone 10 feet. "Come back here, go again. Leona and the doctor have both yammered me about it. We'll forget whatever stands between us and make this strictly a business proposition." "Suits me fine," Rip smiled. "What was on your mind, Major?" Worth sat down heavily on the cot. For a while, he screwed at the hard ground with the point of his cane. Then, "I've got a mountain lion by the tail, Campbell, and I want you to tell me how to let go of him. Or if the varmint's pelt is going to be worth anything, tell me so, and I'll hang on a while longer." "I take it you're referring to St. Louis Southwestern stock," surmised the lawyer. "How did you know that?" Worth demanded closely. "A lot of people in Dos Pasos are likely wondering what they're going to get for their money. A railhead in Fort Worth or a good round reaming." Rip knew the warm heat of the girl's glance as she took a place beside her father. Disdain and respect, based on the hope that he could help them, blended in her intent features. "Precisely what I have been asking myself," Worth nodded. "I had $11,000 when we came here for my health. I bought this ranch for a song and put the rest of the money in McLeod's stock. He promised us dividends within 3 months. It's been 6 now, and I haven't received a cent." Rip guessed at the rest. "And now, there's an installment due on some note or other, and you need those dividends to pay it." "Right. I foolishly borrowed on this ranch to buy more stock. A man can make an awful fool of himself over money. Or maybe I'm not a fool. Maybe there's a fortune waiting for me. That's what I want you to find out, Campbell. Should I hold this stock or try to get rid of it?" "All I can do is guess," Campbell said. "Personally, I don't think St. Louis Southwestern owns a rail or an engine. I'd sell those shares if I were you. It's a question whether you can, with Dos Pasos greased to the armpits with the stuff. Maybe McLeod himself will take it off your hands. But that's only my own, unfounded opinion. I want more than a guess," Dan Worth declared. "If this is going to be something good, I'll try to hang on. Otherwise, I'm unloading right now. I'm retaining you to find out for me as soon as possible, Campbell. Can you do it?" A thought wormed its way into Rip's consciousness as he sat listening to the Major. After quick decision, he nodded. "I think maybe I can. Tomorrow, I'll let you know what I find out. How's that?" Worth stood up, a trifle shakily. "That's fair enough," he nodded. "And now, will you have a drink before you go back, Captain?" "Not in this heat," Rip shook his head. I figure on a pretty heavy afternoon. I'll be seeing you tomorrow, with good news, I hope. At any rate, don't go buying yourself any more stock until then. Rip loped into town about 3 o'clock. He came up the bosque, relishing the comparative coolness of the willow-shaded creek. Without pausing even for some badly needed lunch, he headed for the telegraph office and wired the Merchants Association at St. Louis. The answer was back by the time he wolfed a plate of stew at the Irishman's and returned to the office. Rip stared at the message for a full half-minute. His final reaction was to whistle softly to himself and hurry to old Sarge's print shop. He found the old printer just putting the evening paper to bed. "Hold it, Sarge," he directed, as the one-legged man turned at his entrance. "I'll pay you double your usual space rates for a couple of 2-column bases. But they've got to go in today." Sarge calmly sat down, twisted off his wooden leg, and took a sizable slug of 40-rod. "Let's see what you got," he growled. He had not taken 2 looks at the matter Rip scrawled out when he threw the papers on the floor and swore. "Why, you damned young fool," he choked, unshaven cheeks reddening, eyes flashing dangerously. "I wouldn't print this for my worst enemy. It's murder. You trying to get yourself killed?" "Never shy from printing the truth," the lawyer counseled. "I want these set up just as is. And here's the other ad. Listen, Rip." Sarge fastened a claw-like hand on his shoulder. "Is this on the level?" Rip slapped the 2 telegrams on the counter. "It's gospel," he declared. "I wired the St. Louis Merchants Association to find out if any such railroad had been started there, and here's their answer. Replying to your query, St. Louis Southwestern Railroad has laid 20 miles of track in the last 8 months. Firm is small and of doubtful intention, though legally incorporated. You see, Sarge, McLeod's really on the up and up in the eyes of the law, but he's sure as hell bleeding Dos Pasos dry. I intend to let the whole town know about him. The other thing I want you to print is this. Party will pay $50 per $100 worth of St. Louis Southwestern Railroad stock. Apply D. Campbell, across from Plaza. Will you do that for me, old-timer?" Old Sarge was dolefully unscrewing his liquor leg again. "So help me, if it's true I'll print it," he vowed. "It can't do no more than start another civil war." Baylor's little 4-page sheet hit the street at 5 o'clock, carrying its load of dynamite. By 6, 4 men had already come furtively into Rip's small office by the rear entrance, one by one. All were small ranchers. All told the same shame-faced story. They had loaded up on the stock, expecting the dividends to take care of interest and installments on their mortgages. But the dividends did not materialize, and they wanted to sell a few shares for enough to pay the notes. No one else would buy at face value, as they all seemed to be in the same boat. Just before dark, a cowman Rip remembered from the past came in quietly yet hurriedly. He took a seat where the lamp's yellow rays could not find his face. He was Abel Blair, a big man before the war, a desperate one now. He was a heavy, slow-spoken fellow, with a tough beard and thick gray hair. Cold and forbidding with trouble crowding him, Rip remembered how his eyes could light up with tiny, bright sparks when he was amused. But he wasn't amused now. "These telegrams," he muttered, throwing the paper before Rip. "They're some kind of a joke, ain't they?" Rip's eyes showed how miserably conscious he was of the terror in Blair's heart. "I wish I could say so, Abel," he told him. "They aren't, though. They're on the level." Blair shot to his feet, face working. "That's a cheap lie," he stormed. "It ain't enough that you helped to ruin the South. You're broadened to see your own friends in the dirt. McLeod'll make you retract this, Campbell." "He can't. It's the truth." Blair seemed to fight for control. "What about the party that wants to buy stock at half price?" "That you too." Rip told him a little more than he'd told the others. He felt that it was a cruel joke, but eventually he hoped it would work toward their own welfare. "I just wanted to find out how many men were in the same spot a client of mine is," he said. "He borrowed to buy stock and can't make the grade now that the notes are due. That's the trouble with the whole town." Abel Blair grabbed up his hat. "Don't you worry none about us," he advised. "We'll be rollin' in money when you're cussin' yourself for not buying while you could. McLeod won't let us down. And he'll see to your needin's too." He had hardly slammed the door when the sixth visitor slipped in. And by the look on the battered face of Red Hyatt, the man who had accosted him in the Bull's Head, Rip Campbell knew that hell was on the prowl. Chapter 7. "McLeod wants to see you now," was Hyatt's surly announcement. He slouched in the doorway, hat dangling down his back from the lanyard, the red evening light behind him. "He knows where to find me," Rip snapped. Hyatt came in, tossed an envelope on the desk in front of the lawyer. With his eyes on the red-headed gunman, Rip tore it open. On the fancy engraved stationery of the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad, Vance McLeod had written, "Received of D. Campbell, $5,000 in payment of 50 shares of stock. Vance R. McLeod, agent." It was partly curiosity, partly the boldness of it, that sent Rip reaching for his hat. He jammed the envelope in his hip pocket, motioned Hyatt out the door. "Let's go see him," he said. "Now you're talking smart," the gunman smirked. He swaggered outside, and they proceeded toward McLeod's office. Around the corner from the bank, Hyatt unlocked a door, and they climbed to the second story. Unconsciously, Rip loosened his gun in its holster as they went through a second door into McLeod's office. Entering the small, tastefully appointed room, Rip was struck squarely in the eyes by bright lamplight. McLeod was only a vague blur as he came to his feet from back of a desk and gave Rip a chair. The lawyer deliberately moved the chair so that the light was no longer in his eyes. It was an old dodge, calculated to put a man at a disadvantage in case of trouble. He saw Kaylee sitting near him, somberly drawing at a cigarette. Herb Caton, the blonde, barrel-built puncher who'd sided Hyatt in the saloon brawl, was there too. For an instant, Rip was wishing Sarge Baylor was nearby. But there would be no miraculous rescues made in this hole in the wall. The cards were dealt. His job was to play them smart. He took the receipt out of his pocket and sat on the edge of his chair, tapping the envelope against his knee. "What's the gag, McLeod?" he demanded shortly. McLeod put his cigar out. Rip had to admire the agent's coolness and self-command. His dark, handsome features retained their look of easy complacency. The smile on his lips appeared almost genuine. But nothing could warm those glacier blue eyes of his, so pale beneath black brows. "It's no gag, mister," the railroad man said. "I'm just banking that you've got more brains than you want me to think. I thought you were serious about bucking me before. Now I think I get the picture. You'd like to get in on the gravy train without having to shell out any money. Well, I'll play ball." Doubt scored Rip's brow. "I still don't savvy." "Mac's been held up by experts," Caden snorted. "You can lay off the Pilgrim Act." From a desk drawer, McLeod took a thin packet of gilt-edged bonds. He placed them in Rip's fingers. 50 shares of St. Louis Southwestern, he announced. $5,000 worth. You've got your stake, Campbell. Now keep your yap shut about my company. Maybe you don't get me, Rip drawled, getting slowly to his feet and tossing the stock on the agent's desk. The ads I ran, cut it, McLeod snapped. I savvy you well enough. You figure to raise enough stink so that people will begin to lose confidence in me. They'll sell out short and cause a run on the road. Better companies than mine have been ruined that way. But you're willing to cooperate, aren't you, for a little block of securities? Or have I got you doped out wrong? Plenty. Rip cracked out. If there's any money in this road of yours, it'll all be rolling your way. Those 50 shares won't be worth 50 sacks of Mackins when you spring the trap. Cayley snapped his cigarette into a cuspidor. We'll still be here long after the dealer's got your chips, Campbell, he grunted. Maybe you better swing into line, cowboy. When I change my mind, it won't be because a tin-horn lawyer warned me to. Maybe it'll be because I warned you, McLeod said harshly. I'm not asking you now, Campbell. I'm giving you notice. Hands off my business. Sorry. It's my business too, ever since this afternoon, Rip said enigmatically. On a sudden thought, he retrieved the stock. Maybe I will keep this. I could paper the wall with it some time. Backing to the door, he kept Hyatt, Caton, and Cayley where he could see their slightest move. Caton stirred as though to follow, but McLeod snapped, "Take it easy. Campbell, you're buying that stock the hard way. I'll be around soon, to collect." Rip closed the door, shutting off the sight of 4 darkening faces. With relief strong in him, he hurried back to his office. Sarge was there to meet him, foot and stump propped on the lawyer's desk, blackened stone pipe gripped in his uneven teeth. "You're bunkin' with me tonight," he growled. "Feller with no more savvy than you needs watchin' o' nights. Where you been?" "Seeing a sick friend," Rip grinned. "Don't you worry about me. I'll make out. I just left the big noise, and he seemed right friendly." McLeod again. "Damn it, mister, you don't know him. He's gonna scalp you bald." "If he gets the chance," Rip put in. "But I don't aim to let him." "I hope you're right." "Well, have it your own way. But sleep light, son." Before he crawled into bed, Rip took the precaution of scattering bald newspapers about the floor. It was a trick he'd learned from an old trooper in the army. Sleep came quickly to him, weary as he was. Toward midnight, his rest broke like a snapped fiddle string. Someone had kicked one of those papers. Rip's fingers closed on the warm handle of the gun beneath his pillow. In the same instant, something heavy smashed down at him from the left. The lawyer rolled away from the bludgeon, escaping with only a bruised shoulder. He tried to center his gun on the moving, dark target, but the covers tangled it, and he fired into the ceiling. Bedlam seemed to explode in the room. 2 more shapes loomed from the foot of the bed. Gunfire seared the blackness. Rip felt lead puncture the pillow under his arm, heard the whine of a slug ricocheting off the brass bedpost. But he was moving like chain lightning now. He struck the floor, went rolling under the bed. He fired twice. He could see 3 pairs of legs moving down to the foot of the bed. Then someone crouched, preparing to pour flaming lead into him. Rip's lean body folded up so that his neck was against the bed springs. He came up like an atlas, carrying spring, mattress, and covers from their places like a rising trapdoor. The men yelled in surprise as one of them toppled over on top. Then there was a crash against the door. Someone came hurtling through. Rip's gun whipped around. In the nick of time, the headlong figure yelled at him. A grin eased the grim set of his jaw. Count on old Sarge to be nearby in times like this. The next thing he knew of the attackers, they were piling through the second-story window, one after the other. There was a thud, and a jingle of boot heels on the hotel's wooden awning. Rip sprang after them, snapped a quick shot down into the street. The lead found only boards, as the last of the gunmen dropped from the awning to the saddle of his horse. "Crawl up here," Sarge gasped, crawling around the window, puffing the lawyer after him. "Horses. I left a couple around the corner, before I took the room next door to yours. Come on." Excitement poured its hot liquor in Rip's veins. Here was a chance to follow, to get a line on his attackers. He prayed McLeod would be among them. Sarge sprawled in the street after dropping, stumping around the corner. Rip leapt into the saddle and spurred after them. As he rode, he stuffed fresh shells in his empty gun. In the faint light of a crescent moon, the trees loomed darkly along the quiet bosque. Rip raised a hand for a halt. They sat there in the saddle a moment, heads canted on the side, listening. Suddenly, far downstream, the hoofbeats beat up through the shallow water and brush crashed. Sarge was off without waiting for orders. His big sharps was in his arms, bouncing with every lunge of the horse beneath him. They kept to the stream, trusting its shallows more than the broken branch-matted banks above. A minute went by, while Dos Pasos fell behind, and the trees grew thicker and the stream bent sharply toward the Comanche hills to the west. Rip's sharp ears were first to seize on the hoofbeats ahead. Without a word, he veered up the bank. 50 yards from the creek, the trees ceased for a narrow clearing. Rip's heart leapt as he saw the three forms bent over the nubbins of their saddles, tearing for the palo fierro-clad hummock beyond. Sarge let out a yell, and he looked back startled. The old Confederate was trying to draw a bead on one of them, quieting his mount as best he could. Just for a second, the pony stopped its rearing. In that moment, Sarge's stubby forefinger pulled the trigger. Rip knew by instinct which man would be hit. His hunch was right. The central figure screwed violently in the saddle, throwing his hands aloft. He went down, and his horse roared on, empty-saddled. Sarge had chosen the middle man to give himself 3-to-1 odds. If he missed him, he might drop one of the others at either side. Chapter 8. As if by telepathy, the other two riders split up. One man cut off to the south, the other veered northward. Rip jerked his head at the one on the left. "Catch yourself a man," he cried. "I'll take this in." The trees swallowed the gunman, and Rip sliced into the brushy copse after his picked prey. Buckthorn ripped at his shirt and Levi's. It was dangerous work. Dangerous not only because of hidden prairie dog holes, but because his man could turn on him before he knew it. The going became slower. Ahead, there was the broken scramble and crash of a horse laboring through difficult going. Then a gun spoke. It was far to the right, and the high, sharp crack of it was not Sarge Baylor's buffalo gun. Rip faltered. He was listening for the booming response of his partner's rifle. When it did not come, he drew rein, swearing softly. He had lost interest in the chase, as fear for Sarge chilled him to the marrow. Very soon, the racket of the boogered gunman faded into the night, and there was nothing but the sound of his own horse. He pulled rein. "Sarge," he called tentatively. "Over here, damn it," an angry voice floated back. Rip's throat tightened a little, with relief. He found Sarge Baylor seated at the foot of a big tree, holding a shattered wooden dowel in his hand. "The gun lousy polecat," he ground out. "Shot my leg off at the knee. I'll miss this'n worse than the one I left at Bull Run. You couldn't drink out of that'll." Rip had to help him into the saddle, though the old printer swore it wasn't necessary. At a trot, they returned to where the gunman had been dropped. Shock hit them both when they stared at the spot. He had vanished. Rip wagged his head sadly. "Polecats they be," he muttered, "but they come back for their dead. No use following them now, old-timer. They'll be holed up and licking their wounds." They headed back for town at a slow gait. Abruptly, the lawyer's hand grabbed the Sarge's arm. His eyes were for the crawling shape making slowly for the creek. "Wait a minute. Is that a dog sneak em across that clearing, or?" Baylor squinted through his steel-rimmed glasses. "Yup," he decided. "It's a dog, all right. The one I potted 15 minutes ago. Them skunks don't bury their dead after all." Rip shot ahead, swung down hastily beside the wounded man. Sarge's victim collapsed an instant before the cavalryman reached him. Rip turned him over, exposing the freckled features and glazing eyes of Red Hyatt. Hyatt snarled at him like a wounded cougar. Blood was on his lips, in his nostrils, on his shirt. He had been drilled through the lungs, front and back. "Easy, fella," Rip murmured. "Looks like your pards went off without you. We'll get you back before. Take your dirty hands off me," the wolfish killer gasped. "I don't want no part of you." Seeing that he had only seconds to live, Rip queried softly, "Why don't you go clean, Hyatt? You owe McLeod for this." Hyatt's throat was rattling horribly. "Yeah?" he whispered. "Then give him this for me." Without warning, he smashed his fist into Rip's face. Campbell went over on his back, spitting blood from a cracked lip. When he scrambled back, Red Hyatt had played his whole card and left the game. Rip Campbell got up slowly, to stand looking down at the dead man. "Well, that's one way of going," was all he could think of to say. Sarge was trying to climb back on his horse, and finally managing after a lot of swearing and clawing at odd bits of harness. "We had a fella like him at Shiloh," he pronounced sadly. "We called him Wildcat. He sat up o' nights, thinking of new cuss words to call the Yanks, and when he got shot, he wanted to be stuffed with powder, a fuse put in his mouth, and rode out on his boss into the Union camp. We might have tried it, but he was all loose so full of bad liquor that the stuff likely would have gone off premature. Let's go back, son. I'm an old man, and one gun scrape per night is sufficient." Rip had not dreamed of the ruckus he was stirring up when he had Sarge print those telegrams in the Herald. But it seemed to take its time about building up, like slow-burning black powder getting ready to go off. By the next morning, every man in Dos Pasos who owned a share of stock had read the wires and asked around until he found out they were valid. At noon, there was a line 3 deep in front of Vance McLeod's office. McLeod was not there, and word began to be shuttled around that he had skipped. Barely in time to stop an incipient riot, the railroad man appeared on the street. For a moment, as he appeared around the corner, he stopped like a man who has been struck in the face. Kaylee and Herb Caton looked stunned too. In the next moment, McLeod's long, hurrying strides were carrying him to his door and the head of the line. "Whatever from hell!" Rip heard his belligerent exclamation, where he sat in the dry, dusty little plaza. He watched McLeod unlock the door and mount to a position higher than the crowd. "Now, what in the hell's the meaning of this?" McLeod bawled. "Well, Blair?" Abel Blair's fist shook a tattered copy of the Herald under his nose. "Is this stuff true or ain't it?" he challenged. "That's what we want to know." McLeod took the paper, and without so much as glancing at it, flung it to the ground. "I didn't think you were damned fools enough to swallow that bilge," he scourged. "If you ain't bright enough to tell truth from lies yourselves, don't come crawling to me. Is that all you're pawing the ground about?" His voice, deep and resonant, carried to the back of the restless throng. By the very power of his presence, he seemed to hold the cattleman tongue-tied. But Blair rose to the question once more. "A man can't help wondering when he's got his life savings tied up in this stuff," he countered. "It wouldn't be the first time you've had us guessing. How about the dividends we was to get 3 weeks ago?" The look Vance McLeod gave him, and the rest was the haughty stare a St. Bernard might bend on a pack of curs at his heels. "You damned gutless swine," he sneered. "You'd kick because a gift horse didn't have gold teeth. I told you the dividend would probably come through on the 7th. It didn't, principally because the company's pushing the road along months ahead of schedule, and it takes extra money to do it. However, it don't mean those dividends won't come through within the next month. But if you're ready to tuck your tails and slink back into poverty," suddenly to Caton, "hold them here, Herb. I'll be back pronto." He disappeared up the stairs to his office. A moment later, he was back with a bulging black satchel. "Line up single file," he ordered. "I'll buy back every share of stock you men want to sell me." The sickening thought smashed at Rip Campbell that he had had Vance McLeod doped out all wrong from the start. He sat there stunned, watching while 8 or 10 ranchers sheepishly lined up and began trading their stock for cash. The railroad man's dark features were stone cold. He took 3 shares from a portly cowman and placed 3 crisp century notes in his wet hand. The others stood back. They had formed a little cluster of doubtful, half-angry men, fingering their thick packets of stock while they pondered what to do. Rip suddenly realized the feel of it. McLeod's giving him the stock had been a bribe. A grin grew on his lips as he got to his feet and thrust the thick sheaf of bonds into McLeod's hands. "Here's 50 shares, he grinned. $5,000, I think. I'll take the cash, and you can have the stock." McLeod did not bat an eye. He counted the money and turned it over to Rip. This forestalled an uncomfortable thought. "You was shyin' from St. Louis Southwestern all along," a puncher muttered in front of him. It caught the lawyer's attention for an instant, and the gunman muttered, "I'll pay you for the rest later." "The rest?" Rip asked. "Red Hyatt. That calls for a settlement." "You're right," Rip nodded soberly. "But stick around a while when you come to pay. I'll be wanting to give you a receipt." With $5,000 of McLeod's money in his jeans, Rip sauntered back to his office. He fully realized the dangerous twist he had given the railroad man's tale, but he knew this too. McLeod would be looking for a quick cleanup and a getaway, and it would take some quick piece of work to stop him. There was, on the other hand, the fact that he had sunk a lot of money in land here in Dos Pasos. Maybe a run was not on his list, but whatever he planned, Rip intended to crowd him to the point where he showed all his cards. His duty to Dan Worth was uppermost right now. With his thoughts on how he could tell the old Southerner, he returned to his office. There was a light buggy standing in front of the door. That alone aroused his curiosity, but when he entered and found Dan Worth and his daughter there, he was wordless for the moment. Worth shook his crooked cane. "I keep a man waiting. Have you seen the Herald?" Rip asked. Worth's hand went out silently. He perused the articles. Leona sat there by the window, with eyes wide and shadowed, waiting for Rip to speak. "In other words," Worth breathed. "You've got a wildcat by the tail," Rip grunted. "That stock of yours won't be worth a dime when McLeod lets the bubble break." "Then why haven't you jailed him?" The Tennessean roared, standing up. "The law can't touch him. Maybe if I knew what was going on in Farley Parker mind, we could get at McLeod. But I don't." Worth showed signs of exploding. His face grew purple, in startling contrast to his silvery hair. Not until Leona slid her arm about his shoulders did he control himself. Her courage made Rip more than ever want to find a way out for them. There was more than admiration for her in his eyes, for when she looked up at him, new color dyed her cheeks. "What can we do?" she asked him helplessly. "5 minutes ago you could have cashed it in and saved yourself," Rip sighed. "It's too late now." McLeod had the guts to stop a run on his outfit by offering to pay cash at the graveside for all unwanted stock. The bluff worked like he'd figured. No one but a few small holders cashed their shares. Blair and the big men were fools. They decided he was on the level and held on to theirs. "Saying it straight out," Daniel Worth snapped, "I'm ruined, we're all ruined." "That's jumping at conclusions." Rip made an effort to put confidence in his voice. "I may be able to find a loophole McLeod forgot to plug up." Leona's lips framed a slight smile. "But the chances are, Captain," she said, "you won't, will you?" Rip was saved having to answer, as 2 men slowed before the shop and turned in. It was Sarge Baylor, looking deeply troubled, and Abel Blair. Blair was laughing. Good-naturedly, he slapped Sarge on the back. "Well, you two had to team up somehow," he taunted Rip. "I guess Vance cleared himself, even in your eyes, E.A. Campbell." "If a dog's hind leg was any crookeder than McLeod," Rip drawled, "he'd have to run in a circle." Slowly, the big rancher's grin died, as he glanced at the other sober faces in the office. Then he snorted, "Ah, hell, you mossbacks give me a pain. I didn't know you ran to chicken guts, Worth. I'm getting out of here before I catch something and begin to knit doilies." "Hold up, Abel," Sarge said, glancing at him over the tops of his spectacles. Feller I just talked to told me something you might be interested in. Think it'd interest you too, Rip." Blair stopped in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling it, a scowl on his bearded features. "Well?" Sarge scratched his grizzled pate, a little embarrassed by all the attention he was getting. "Feller named Charlie Goodnight, runs cattle up Panhandle Way. Just made the first trail drive since the war, this gent told me. This gent was with him as a cowhand. Seems they ran 2,000 head to Fort Sumner in New Mexico. Sold them there to the government for beef for the reservations." Rip was on his feet, blood pounding through his temples. "He's a liar," Blair snorted. "There ain't no getting through that way. Crossin' the Pecos is suicide, and the Injuns are on the warpath for 500 miles solid. Your man was lying, Sarge. There isn't a market for Texas beef, no place." "Nope," Sarge retorted. "I knowed this boy in the Army, and he ain't given to stringin' the long-windy. Goodnight and his pard Loving cleared a damn good price. And I was thinking that trail was going to be as busy as Broadway in New York." Rip clipped. His eyes shone with unaccustomed fervor. "What that means to Texas is that the end of the Depression is in sight. We've so thought there was no market for our beef because the southern states couldn't pay for it, and the northern ones were too far away. But the government can buy and will buy from here on out. Every fort and every Indian reservation will have to have meat, and Texas is going to supply it." Chapter 9. Rip was speaking again, even before the others had fully grasped his meaning. "What that means to Dos Pasos is this, and it ain't pretty. McLeod owns half the valley and holds mortgages on the rest." "You're wrong," Blair panted, far less blustering now. "Parker holds my note. Most of the others, too. McLeod ain't the one." "Same thing," Campbell grunted. "He's got a mortgage on Parker. When he starts talking up the slack in his loop, every one of you is going to get choked out. You borrowed money on your spreads and turned it over to him to ruin you with." Blair came back into the room, the suggestion of a stagger in his advance. On his splayed fingers, he leaned across Rip's desk to choke out, "That's a damned lie. You're a loose-talkin', shyster lawyer. You've," his eyes shifting down the street, Rip raised a hand to stay Blair's words. "Just a minute, Abel," he said quietly. "Sarge, did you spread this news about Goodnight around?" Sarge scraped at his unshaven cheeks. "Well, yes, in a manner o' speakin'. I printed it in the Herald an hour ago." "Aha. And Farley Parker has read it, I judge. He's headin' here on the double quick." He strode to the rear door and flung it open. "You wanted proof, Abel," he jerked. "Here's where you get it. I have an idea what Parker is going to want. All of you, get in the back room and keep quiet. Don't argue. In you go." When Parker came in, Rip was examining some documents at his desk. Parker, rasping tones, knifed the thick silence. "Campbell, is this another of your practical jokes?" He held a copy of the paper, still wet from the press. Rip studied the man, ignoring the paper. He seemed to look through the elegance of Parker attire to the small, frightened soul beneath. "As far as I know," he shrugged, "that's gospel. Stacks up to something pretty big, doesn't it?" The banker seemed to wilt into a chair, keeping his haggard eyes on the other's smiling face. "You know damned well what it stacks up to. Ruin for Dos Pasos, for my depositors, for me. Mostly for you. You trusted McLeod too, yea? You weren't in it with him." Parker's small black eyes searched his face. Then he leaned forward. "I was wrong yesterday, Campbell. I'm willing to admit that, now. And I want to ask your help. No harm in asking. It's plain what McLeod's been about now. God, if I could have seen it before. His railroad, all it was a blind to cover his land and cattle workings. He's got the whole valley under his thumb. He owns us body and soul. How far have you gone with him? Rip asked narrowly. Farley Parker shrugged helplessly. All the way. I bought stock with my depositors' money. Sold my notes to McLeod and reinvested in stock. Now, what am I going to do? I can't sell it. If I admit my mistake, it means the pen. The others will be demanding their money tomorrow at 9 o'clock when my doors open. They're bound to wake up now. He steadied himself by a visible effort. The only man who can help me is you. I don't see how. By depositing that $20,000 of pay in my bank. I'll hold out long enough to stop the run and get McLeod. That's a fine idea, Rip scoffed. I lose my shirt to save yours. How do you propose to catch the he-coon? Parker looked at him hopelessly. There must be some way. You're a lawyer. You should be able to do it. I don't know how, Rip shrugged. You got yourself into this, and now you've got to get out the same way. All I can do is to advise you to tell the story to Marshal Lafee and have him hold McLeod in technical custody. That will give us time to investigate the outfit from top to bottom. If there's any way to nail him, you'll be saved. That's a hell of a prospect. It's the only one, Campbell said. You'd better take it quick. All hell's going to break loose in the morning. Parker stood in the door, looking apprehensively up the street. Without turning his head, he muttered, I suppose you're right. You were last time. I'll get in touch with Lafee tonight. No, maybe, he turned quickly, and Rip was quick to note the change that had come to his ferret-like eyes. Maybe I'd better spend the rest of the afternoon and tonight straightening things up as best I can. The bank's not ready for a thorough examination. I'll tell Lafee in the morning. It's your decision, Rip advised him quietly. I'll try to hold things down until then. Parker came back to seize his hand. I don't deserve your help, Campbell, he said heavily, but for the sake of my depositors, I thank God you're on my side. He rushed from the office, heading for his bank with head down and hat pulled low over his face. Abel Blair was a man grown old when he emerged from the back room. Pity filled Rip's heart, but for his and Worth's mute looks of despair he mustered only empty hope. I'm sorry, Abel, he murmured. For the sake of all of Dos Pasos, I wish I'd been wrong. All I can say is this, go to McLeod and demand your money back. Probably, it won't do you any good. He's stemmed the tide and won't run his bluff again. Worth, you'd better stay in town tonight. There may be big things doing in the morning, and it might be best if you're around. Wordlessly, the group left the office, leaving Rip to misery and silence. There was no tinge of vengeance in this situation, for him. The Dos Pasoans had scorned him, and his advice had let him know they wanted no part of him. Now they were in the thorny spot of facing ruin because they had neglected his counsel. He felt his inability to help them keenly. That night he sat up late, his feet propped on the windowsill where he could watch the lazy comings and going of wagons, horses, and men in the street below. Big twilight melded a gaudy brush over the rangeland, folding away to the snag-toothed Comanche hills in the east. Along every little ridge, lacy smoke trees hung like puffs from council fires. There was coolness down in the bosque, coolness and shadow, but shadows hide renegade guns too well, so Rip sat in his room with no lamp to silhouette him. At 11 o'clock, he rose and prepared for bed. But even as he stooped to tug off his boots, there came a frantic rapping on his door. He drew his gun. Who is it? It's Beth, the answer came. You've got to help me. Still fearing a trap, Campbell unlocked the door and let her in. Her face was terror-filled. Parker, she gasped. He's leaving, Rip, on the Sulphur City stage. Shock quickened Campbell's pulse, but suspicion still tempered his reactions. Well, what of it? Hasn't he got a right to? It came to him that Beth knew nothing of the situation between Parker and the railroad outfit. "You don't understand," the woman gasped. "Doss told me McLeod's got all his money in the bank. But he never did trust that Parker, and he's had an eye on him. Tonight, Doss didn't come home, and I went to the saloon looking for him. They told me him and McLeod were out at McLeod's ranch. On the way home, I passed the bank, and Parker was coming out with a bag in his hand. He's on the stage right now, and it's puffing out. Why didn't you call the marshal? What could I tell him?" Beth wailed. "He'd think I was crazy. But you know the kind Parker is." "Rip, you got to." Rip was shoving the woman out of the way. "If this is a game of yours," he flung at her. Swiftly, he strode down the hall and plunged down the stairs. Night held the main street. Rip broke into a run, cut west on Allen Street toward the express office. Excitement stirred him as the gleam of the stage's lanterns showed down the way. The driver's "gee-yap" and the crack of a whip built to his ears. Leather thorough braces creaked, and wooden hubs began to chuckle. Then from the curb, the coach swung into the street and headed toward where Rip stood near the corner. Campbell's gun was in his hand, ready for the moment when he would spring onto the step plate and find out whether Beth had been lying. That moment didn't come. As the Concorde rattled by an alley, men converged swiftly on it from the darkness. A gun roared, and the driver fell from his box. Someone sprang to the door, and it was thrown back. From the dark interior blasted one shot, then lead poured through windows and doors, and the gun did not speak again. Frozen with shock, Rip saw the attackers melt away as silently as they had come. With the coach beginning to rattle on, unguided, someone heaved a body from the door. Springing down, the man fired 2 more shots into the body and darted away. Even in the gloom, Rip was able easily to identify the victim as dapper Farley Parker. Then, abruptly, there was movement behind the lawyer. A gun crashed, and Rip's senses melted into a gyro of whirling lights. Chapter 10. There was faint light in the cell where he awoke. A hard pallet under his back, and his head was bound in a tight bandage. Giddiness assailed him with the effort of sitting up. Stupidly, he stared at the barred window across from him. Now his eyes widened, and he lurched to his feet. Memory flowed back to him in a swift, terrifying torrent. Rip sprang to the heavy wooden door and shouted through the little grilled window, "Marshal? What the hell's going on?" Pretty soon, a door opened, and Leffie swung calmly down the corridor. Dawn was pouring its rosy colors through the jail's windows, but it failed to make the place any more beautiful to Rip Campbell. "Forgot already, have you?" the marshal inquired. He was grinning a hard, mirthless grin, a half-finished cigarette in his fingers. "Well, maybe a man can even forget murder when a slug creases him like it done you. I could have told you before, you'd never like this town. You was looking for trouble when you hit the streets, and you found it. Harbold died last night, by the way, and McLeod says now he ain't sure but what you was to blame." Rip's eyes studied his sardonic features. "Is that what I'm in here for?" "Young feller, you almost make me laugh," Leffie said sarcastically. "You ain't forgot about killing the Wells Fargo man and Farley Parker, have you? We found you with an empty gun in your fist, lying 10 feet from Parker in the road. You made a good job of killing him. 3 shots in the head and 2 in the body. He nicked you over the ear, in case you didn't know." All Rip Campbell could do was stand there. A picture floated before his mind. Beth Cayley laughing over the way he'd grabbed the bait. Vance McLeod perhaps paying her off. Plain enough how he'd been tricked. McLeod's men pulled the holdup, slugged him, and dragged him out in the road. Well, Parker had found his reward. That was one consolation. And that was the only consolation. He was in here on a double murder charge, and it was all over with the Dos Pasos ranchers. Marshal Leffie was staring at him. "Well, ain't you going to deny it?" he demanded. "You better start whipping your story into shape. Tomorrow morning, you stand trial for 2 murders. By the way, there's somebody waiting to see you. I'll send her in." "Wait a minute, Marshal," Rip stopped him. "Did they find Parker money on him?" Leffie laughed out loud. "So that's what you were after? Son, you're going to do the necktie dance for nothing. Parker vault was still full of stock, bonds and cash when I checked it 2 hours ago." His laughter drifted hollowly back to the lawyer as he left the block. Of all the people Rip would have expected to visit him, Leona Worth was the last. Her coolness toward him had never thawed. But now he found himself thrilling to the sympathy in her eyes, in the way her small, cool hand came to him. "All I can say, Rip," she smiled bravely, "is that I'm sorry and ready to believe you didn't do it." His fingers closed warmly on hers. It was strange to him how much he wanted her to believe him. "It was McLeod," he said wearily. "I tipped my hand for a minute, I guess, and he got me." He told her the story, and the way anger glowed in her eyes at mention of Beth Cayley reminded him of the first time he'd seen her, wind-blown, furious, indignant. "McLeod's not letting time waste while he gets his pound of flesh," he finished. "I stand trial tomorrow. I suppose Cayley will be prosecuting attorney." "That's what they're saying," Leona agreed. "Dad said to tell you he'd stand expense of bringing a lawyer from Sulphur Springs to defend you if you want one." "I'll take a chance on my own talents," Rip said. "By the way, have they checked the passenger list on the stage? What I want to know is, who was the other man in the coach with Parker? The stage man said there was only Parker on the list." "Are you sure? Something's haywire. I watched that other cold-blooded gent fire 2 shots into Parker's head." "Say, wait." Leona was watching him anxiously. "Yes," she prompted. Rip changed his mind about what he was going to say. "You can do me a favor, Miss Worth, Leona," she corrected, smiling. Rip grinned. "Then this'll make the second favor you've done me. Send Sarge Baylor here, and tell him to bring his liquor leg if he's replaced it yet. I could stand a jolt right now." Leona moved away from the door. "If he's alive and sober, which last is a moot question, the way he was carrying on after they jailed you, I'll have him here in 10 minutes. Sarge was down at the jail in much less than that, although considerably the worse for 40 Rod. He stood weaving before Rip's cell, wearing his tattered old gray uniform and peering fiercely over the tops of his glasses at the cavalryman. "He's gone too far," Sarge declared thickly. "I'll have his scalp for this. What have you been doing to yourself?" Rip scowled at him. "Of all the times to get polluted, ain't drunk at all. I been digging in your law books, finding a way to save you. You won't find it there. Tell you where you will find it, though. Up the valley someplace." Sarge snorted. "Now who's drunk?" he accused. Rip clutched the bars with both hands. "Listen to me, old-timer. Go home and drown yourself in black coffee until you're sober. I'll need you tonight, like I've never needed you. You suppose you could get a file in that liquor leg of yours?" "Shouldn't be shoe-prized," Sarge said, beginning to grin. "You want I should come back later?" "Right away. I'll need all day to get anywhere. I've got to be out of here tonight, or I'm as good as hung right now. Soon as the town gets quiet after sundown, you get a couple of horses and have them in a likely spot. We're going places." Through the long, wearing day, Rip alternately sawed on the hinges of his door and dived for the bunk at Leffie's approach. Toward evening, he was beginning to get the job in satisfactory shape. Both hinges were far enough gone that a few more strokes would finish them. About the middle of the afternoon, with all the bosky in an uproar over the suspected treachery of McLeod, reports began to drift in of ranchers dispossessed for non-payment of notes held by the agent. Abel Blair rattled into town in an old buckboard. His family and a few belongings were with him. His face showed the marks of a vicious fist-whipping. Standing in the wagon with curious, confused stockholders gathered around him on the ground, he shook his fist in the direction of McLeod's office. From his cell window, Rip could just hear Abel Blair's shouted words. "A fine passel of morons we've been. Given ourselves into that snake's hands. McLeod and his crowd just throwed me out of the house I built 30 years ago. I'm cleaned out, you hear? Just like you're going to be when he gets around to you. And you want to know who was right about him? That boy they've got in jail waiting to be hung. If you're worth a damn, you'll go beg his pardon for cussing him out." Rip had plenty of visitors after that. Men who were willing to forget he had been their enemy for 4 years. Men who had laughed at his warnings a day before. All of them had a handshake, an apology, and a word of hope for him. Evening came, and then a vast darkness. Clouds obscured the moon and stars. Gradually, the noises of the upset town died out. Someone stopped on the boardwalk before the jail and struck a match to a pipe. Rip recognized Sarge's face. No word was spoken, but the old-timer went down the alley next to the jail, and Rip got the message he intended to convey. No profit in waiting longer, Rip decided. He finished the hinges and left his cell. The far door did not yield to his gentle push. Locked, he swore to himself. But he knew about how it fitted into the scheme of the room beyond, and drew back for an attempt that would carry all his hopes. His whole body was racked with the impact of smashing against the door. He went through at a stumbling fall. Marshal Leffie came awake in his chair with a snort. His gun left its sheath, but Rip had crashed into him and carried chair and all against the wall. The gun went off into the ceiling, filling the room with its warning roar. Rip wrenched it from the marshal's grip. "Keep your head, and you'll keep a whole hide," he cautioned. "I'm going, Marshal, and I'm not stopping for hell or high water. Don't let me see you out of this office for a half-minute." "I'll promise nothing," Leffie said. Rip only half heard the words. He was springing for the door, and into the warm darkness beyond. He knew Leffie would be in hot pursuit with a fresh gun, but all he wanted was a look at that horse. Sarge was waiting, already a saddle, in the vacant lot behind the jail. Without a word, he dropped the reins of a second horse into the lawyer's hand. With the turmoil of yells and scattered shots in their wake, they pounded for the bosque. There was no stopping them that night. They kept to the water for 5 miles and forestalled efficient tracking. Once in the rough, cross-grained arroyos that zigzagged up to the foothills, they knew they were safe. "Hell of a way to treat a man with a hangover," Sarge gloomed. "Now that you're out, what do you plan?" "I wish I knew," Rip admitted thoughtfully. "I'm playing a hunch long enough to hang a man. But I do know this much. The second man in that Concord, the one that got away, is still hiding in the valley. They're saying that McLeod has laid down a quarantine to stop anyone on his suspicious list from leaving. He's got punchers patrolling it everywhere. Parker tried to leave, and look what happened to him. So I figured this man is still around, and I've got to have him at the trial." "You mean you're going back for it?" "It's go back, or listen to the owl hoot all the rest of my life. Now, I've got a feeling this gent would head for some deserted nester shack where he could hide out a spell." "Know of a likely one?" Sarge's brow puckered up. "1 or 2. There's a cabin not far from here, matter of fact. Want to look?" "Lead the way," Rip ordered grimly. "Let me know when we're within a quarter of a mile, and we'll walk then." The plan went through without a hitch, but their walk was just so much exercise as far as results were concerned. 2 more nester shacks were visited, and found to be deserted, with no signs of recent occupation. Then another thought came to the one-legged printer. "Old man Corbus," he exclaimed. "There's your man. He'd hide out Judas himself for a plugged quarter. He's wild and hairy as a javelina, and all morals mean to him is something that comes at the end of a Aesop's fable. He might be your man himself. Want to go see? Why didn't you think of him before?" Rip approved. Vamonos. Chapter 11. There was no light in old man Corbus' disreputable shack where it leaned against a toe of the hills. But at their hail, he came out with a mighty buffalo rifle in his hands. He still wore a dirty nightshirt stuffed into his pants, and his shaggy gray hair hung recklessly down to his shoulders. He was chewing tobacco, his meager jaws champing noisily. They said that he had a cut in his cheek even when asleep. Before the partners knew it, he had swung the rifle so that it rested dead center on them. "Now then, you mangy he-wolves," he snarled, "what be you arter?" Sarge let his rifle drop and raised his hands. "You're a trustin' ol' so-and-so, ain't you?" He sniffed. "We're deputies, Corbus, lookin' for a gent that had a part in the killin' of Parker, the banker, last night. We've been wonderin' if you seen any sign of him." "Maybe," the oldster replied. For a moment, he eyed them calculatingly with his rheumy old orbs. "Then what's the reward?" Sarge dug in his pocket, took out something and said, "Look it." When old man Corbus craned forward curiously, Sarge grabbed at his gun and threw a looping left into the side of his jaw. Corbus made a sound like a tormented wolf. Scarecrow-like, he landed all spraddled out to stare up at the two .45s held firmly in Sarge's fists. Rip clapped Sarge on the back and started for the cabin, knowing such a procedure was the only one that would have gained them a look inside. Caution tugged at his heels. Then he heard Corbus cackling laughter and turned around. "Heh heh heh," the old nester wheezed. "That'll buy you nothin'. I got him hid out in a cave half a mile from here. You won't find him." Rip knew a gnawing despair. A posse could search a week and never find the right cave in this broken section. But two men with only the night to work, and a dying night at that. Suddenly, a new thought struck him. He still carried his wallet with a generous poke of yellow backs in it. "How does $100 sound to you, Corbus?" "Better," the nester nodded shrewdly, beginning to smile. "Make it 200, and he's yours." Rip gave him the money. He said, "Keep your eye on him, Sarge. He's a crafty old buzzard. Bring our man back and keep him hidden until the trial. If he's the one I think, a certain party would massacre him on sight. I'm heading back to try and get my case lined up before 9 in the morning." "I've got you, son," Sarge Baylor grunted. "He'll be there, one way or another." Dos Pasos yawned in the first pale pearl glow of dawn when Rip Campbell dropped rein in front of the jail 2 hours later. Postmen, by twos and threes, were dragging into town after the chase. The restaurants were filled with men satisfying night hunger, and a number of horses rubbed sides before the saloon. Street lamps flickered fitfully in the growing dawn. Rip went into the jail with a high heart. But the office was empty. He sat down at the marshal's desk and busied himself with studying his chances to beat the charge saddled onto him. Very shortly, the tramp of boots sounded up the walk, and Leffie himself turned in. Behind him came McLeod, Caton, and a couple of other railroad gunmen. There was an instant of silence, then Leffie exploded, "Damn me for a shorthorn, if that ain't." McLeod's powerful body was lunging past him, guns dragging from the yellow holsters at his thighs. "We're talking no chances this time, Marshal. He's wanted." Campbell had a horrible instant of staring into McLeod's black gun bores. The next moment, Marshal Leffie slammed the big railroad man aside and seized his guns by the barrels. With cold fury drawn in his small eyes, he challenged McLeod's savage glare. "Don't try that again," he breathed. "You can see as well as I that his guns lay on the desk. I'll be getting the idea You're afraid to have him alive." Campbell saw fear flicker for an instant in McLeod's eyes. Then the railroad man gained control. It was as though his bushwhack attempt was a last-chance effort to save a sinking ship. And that did not jibe with the facts, for Rip was the man who faced a death sentence within a matter of hours. "Sorry, Marshal," McLeod apologized. Maybe I was too quick on the trigger." Contemptuously, Leffie turned away to direct his own gun on the lawyer. "I don't savvy the lights you go by, Campbell," he growled, "but I do know my duty is to get you bacco bars again. This don't change the fact that Judge Buckner will set on your case at 10 o'clock. Thanks for the help, boys. I'll get your pay through soon as I can." Rip passed those last 5 hours sitting on his bunk, smoking Bull Durhams as fast as his fingers could fashion them. He wasn't conscious of anything but the thoughts that crawled through his brain like columns of marching men. Everything depended on Sarge Baylor's coming through for him. That, and his own hunch being correct about the identity of the second passenger. Dos Pasos would be rocked to the roots if the man was who he thought. 2 minutes before the marshal and bailiff came to take him to the courthouse, Leona's face appeared in the aperture of the cell door. Warmth flooded Rip's being as he gripped her hand. Unshed tears glistened in Leona's eyes. "Whatever happens, Rip," she whispered, "I want you to know this. As far as we are concerned, the North and South don't exist anymore. I've been wrong about blaming the North for all our misery. Dad's beginning to realize that too. I came to tell you that I." Her lips trembled as she tried to say what was real. Suddenly she blurted, "Oh, Rip. Rip, dear, you can kiss me if you want." Tears weren't far from Rip Campbell's eyes as their lips met. The bars pressed cruelly against his cheekbones, but for him there was only the deep, burning want of the moment. Then Leona was pulling back, hurriedly murmuring, "They're coming. Rip, just remember that I love you, and that Dos Pasos is behind you to the man." With the stride of boots filling the corridor, Rip smiled. "I won't forget," he said. "And maybe we'll have a surprise or two for them." Judge Buckner was a white-haired, imposing man of 65, heavy in the shoulders and with the kind of presence that quiets a court without the need of a gavel. As the doors of the courtroom were closed on the excited, perspiring crowd, he let his shrewd eyes go over their ranks. Most of the throng drew from ordinary Dos Pasoans. Up near the front, a number of Big M punchers and St. Louis Southwestern men sprinkled the congregation. Finally, the judge's heavy tones sheared the hubbub. "We'll have order, if you please. Is the prosecuting attorney present?" Dawson Cayley got to his feet. "Present and ready, Your Honor." "And the defending attorney?" Silence gripped the room. The hot sunlight, pouring its blistering rays over a portion of the crowd, imparted a dull heaviness to all sounds. The bailiff said in a high-pitched voice, "The prisoner will be his own attorney, Your Honor." Buckner nodded. "Bring him in, quick." Rip Campbell saw more kind looks on the faces of the crowd than he had received in days. "I'm ready, Your Honor," he announced. "You are charged with the murders of Farley Parker and Judd Gray," the juror said briefly. "Mr. Cayley, you may call your first witness." Cayley was all business, laying out papers on his table and fixing a pair of horn-rimmed spectacles on his large nose. Without looking up, he called, "Mrs. Dawson Cayley." Beth, stiff-lipped and nervous, made her way to the stand. Cayley came over to the box and asked her the routine identification questions. Finally, "Did you see the prisoner shortly before the crime, Mrs. Cayley?" "I did." "Tell us about it." Beth wrung her handkerchief in her fingers, glanced briefly over the crowd. "I happened to be coming home late that night," she said, speaking hardly over a whisper. "What did I see but Farley Parker ducking out of his bank with a black bag in his hand. I'd heard he was in trouble, and likely to try to leave town almost any time. I knew the marshal would think I was just imagining things if I called him, So I went and told Rip about it. Him having a lot of money in the bank, as I thought. Rip was furious. He said, "I'll kill that sneaking coyote, and by God I'll do it now." Well, that was all I seen, Your Honor. But I'll swear it was him that— "The court isn't interested in your personal opinions," Buckner intoned. "Your witness, Mr. Campbell." Rip went over and studied a paper in his hand so long that Beth was visibly on trigger edge. Abruptly, he shot at her. "You say Parker was carrying a black bag, Mrs. Cayley. Do you realize none was found on him, or in the boots of the stage after the murder, and that there was not a single penny gone from the vaults?" Beth flushed scarlet. "No, I hadn't heard." Rip's eyes found the jurists, then wandered to the tense jury. "It's like somebody was trying to frame a man and forgot a point," he smiled. "That's all, Mrs. Cayley." Beth fled back into the crowd. McLeod's face went darker, and Cayley ran a finger around the inside of his sweat-stained collar. "Herb Caton," he snapped. Caton swaggered to the stand. At Cayley's question, he went into his lies as though trained in them. "Yeah, I seen plenty that night. I was leaving McLeod's office when Campbell ran past me and stopped the stage. He put a slug through Judd Gray, and then dragged Parker out of the coach and shot him. Parker's gun went off just then, and he winged Campbell." Cayley looked smugly at the jury. "That's all," he said. "Any questions, Mr. Campbell?" "None," Rip grunted. Then, one after the other, Cayley put 4 more men on the stand, including Vance McLeod. Their testimony was similar, that they had personally witnessed the killings. And Rip refused to question them all. The crowd was under a restless tension, realizing he had scored only 1 point. Leona endeavored to capture his gaze, but his eyes stayed on his tabletop. Cayley finally summed up his case. "Just remember," he advised the jury, "that this case is being decided on evidence, not personal feelings. I have proved beyond a doubt that Duffield Campbell did, with malice aforethought, shoot and kill 2 men. The state demands the death penalty." He went back to his seat with the righteous expression of one who has stamped out a sidewinder. A stir went through the Dos Pasos crowd. It was plain that if any shadow lay about Rip's shoulders, it was that of a hangman's noose. No jury could only have convicted him on such evidence as Cayley had dragged before them. Chapter 12. "You have witnesses?" Judge Buckner asked Campbell quietly. "One, Your Honor," Rip told him. "I can have him presently, but first I want to make a few remarks." A stiff, uncomfortable quiet dropped over the courtroom as Campbell rose and placed himself near the judge's desk. Women stopped fanning themselves with their bonnets. The only sounds came from outside, a dog barking in the plaza, and a hot breeze rubbing the leaves of the trees against each other down in the bosque. "It's no secret," Rip said steadily, "that Dos Pasos is in the grip of an octopus. Vance McLeod is the octopus, and the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad is the main tentacle he's using." "I object, Your Honor." Cayley leapt to his feet, overturning his chair. "This matter is irrelevant and immaterial, and has no place in this trial. Instruct the opposing counsel." Buckner slammed his fist down on the desk. "I'll instruct you to keep your advice to yourself," he roared. "This court don't make any pretense to citified ways, and never has. Proceed as before, Mr. Campbell." Cayley recovered his chair in fury-filled silence as Rip went on. "Until yesterday, I was the only one fighting McLeod. To stop me, he offered a bribe, and when that failed, he tried to have me killed. That's how Red Hyatt died, not by cleaning his gun as the coroner was informed." Cayley was on his feet again, excited, shouting, "Slander! McLeod, this court is still in trial, Mr. Cayley. It'll be out of trial if you don't keep your seat," he rapped viciously. "Bailiff, put Mr. Cayley out the next time he raises his voice." A silence, that seemed ready to ignite into violence any moment, fell. Rip's voice struck a lower note. What happened to me, night before last, could have happened to any man who bucked the railroad outfit. It was the neatest frame-up I ever saw. But gentlemen of the jury, I saw enough before I was knocked out to hang 3 men, Dawson Cayley, Herb Caton, and Vance McLeod. I saw them kill Judd Gray and his passenger, and I'm prepared to prove it. He strode to the center aisle, shouted, "Sarge, bring him in." The double doors banged open, and through them moved Sarge Baylor and his prisoner, Farley Parker. A couple of women nearest to Parker fainted. Judge Buckner shot to his feet with sallow features. McLeod may have been startled, or he may not. He only sat there at his place near the wall and stared hard. Rip ran down and rawhided Parker through to the bench. Pandemonium broke loose, and Buckner began to pound with his gavel, while Rip bodily thrust Parker into the witness chair. A little order began to be restored, so that even those in back could hear Rip Campbell. "Now," Campbell roared, "you're going to hear some real, unprejudiced testimony. Parker himself is proof that I didn't kill him. He's going to prove also that McLeod told Judd Gray." It was a turbulent court that listened to the banker's broken testimony. Somehow, Buckner was able to get them quiet enough so that the ragged, bruised caricature of dapper Farley Parker could be heard. McLeod, Caton, and Cayley were all together near the jury stand. Rip leaned close to the banker and ground out low, "You might as well tell the truth, Parker. You haven't violated any law besides mishandling your affairs, and you may beat that rap. Spill the dope on the swine that got you where you are, and I'll help you all I can." Parker nodded dumbly. He wore a dirty, misshapen old suit of brown tweeds. His face was stubbled with black beard, and his eyes seemed to have sunken into his head. "Who was the other man in the coach that night?" Rip demanded. "The one that took the slugs meant for you." "That was Mike Radnor, the old drunk that lived across the river," Parker half-whispered. "What was he doing in your clothes?" Rip cried. "I hired him to wear them. I knew McLeod had laid down a quarantine on the whole valley, and I'd never get out alive. Radnor agreed to go with me, dressed in my clothes and with his hat pulled down over his face, for $100. As soon as the stage started, I jumped in from the side without the drivers knowing it. 5 seconds later, the stage was jumped and Radnor murdered." Rip spun to face the courtroom. "Where's Coroner Page?" he shouted. Page stood up slowly. "Who identified Parker's body before you had him coffined?" the lawyer asked him. Page colored. "Why, nobody. We just sort of took it for granted. Him wearing Parker clothes and jewelry. The face was shot to hell by the last slugs that entered the body." Rip nodded. "Those were the shots I saw the other passengers shoot into his head after he was dead. That was Parker, of course. He saw his one chance to get away and gambled for it. He left the money he was stealing, this is my own opinion which I can't prove, and disappeared." The throng appeared limp with the repeated shocks they had received. Buckner leaned across the desk towards the banker. "And who," he queried, "were the men who killed Radnor?" Parker said, "I only saw one. That was Vance McLeod." It was just then that Rip knew McLeod was moving. He whirled to intercept him. The agent had leapt through the window to the ground outside, Cayley beside him. Caton was trying to follow. McLeod's face showed above the sill for an instant, as he directed his revolver at Farley Parker and triggered twice. The banker sagged back in his chair, shot through the head. Men were shouting, women screaming, and Rip fought his way through them like a tiger. He ripped a man's gun from his holster as he went. Marshal Leffie, at his place near the bench, fired one shot that dropped Herb Caton in his tracks. Then Rip was through the window. Cayley was on the ground, stumbling awkwardly to his feet. He was unsounded, but held no gun in his hands. Rip slammed the butt of his gun across the back of his head as he ran by, The fat lawyer went down on his face with a wheezy sigh. Rip was just in time to see the railroad man whirl around the corner on a giant buckskin stallion. Despair clutched at him as he thought of trying to overtake him in the bosque, mounted as he was on his own pony, one of the most powerful Dos Pasos could offer. He pointed as shouting ranchers swarmed about. On the point of mounting and joining their chase, he stopped suddenly. McLeod was no fool. He wouldn't be leaving $50,000 or $60,000 behind. That thought brought Rip about in a swift pivot to head in the other direction up the street. His long legs carried him swiftly toward the bank. His long-shot hunch nearly cost him his life. As he rounded the corner of the bank, a swift gray shape dashed from the alley. For the second time that day, Rip was looking into the bores of Vance McLeod's big Navy pistols. McLeod's face was a look into hell. Snarling, twisted, it bore slight resemblance to the mask he had shown his customers a day before. His gun leapt in his hand, spat flame and lead into Rip's lunging body. The lawyer found himself flung up against the wall, sick with the agony of a tearing sidewound. McLeod fired his other gun, but this time Rip had matched the move. A black hole dotted the middle of McLeod's forehead. Then scarlet flooded his features and his magnificent body crumpled and went down. Rip slipped to the ground a moment later. They found them that way, an hour later when the fruitless chase led back to town. One of them was dead, and the other lived to tell it in court a week later. Rip Campbell, still weak with his wounds, proved up on his claims in a manner that would have made old Sam Campbell stand and applaud in his grave. St. Louis Southwestern deflated like a broken sack of meal, but every dollar of the rancher's money was in the bank and McLeod's safe. A referee saw to the restoration of it. There was peace along the Moscon Bosque, peace that a war had never brought. Cattlemen went back to work, raising blooded stock to take up the good-night-loving trail. The town took to growing, and the usual trouble and squabbles came with its mushroom growth. But that was all right with Rip and his new wife. When there is trouble, a lawyer prospers, and Rip Campbell kept Sarge so busy running off forms and the like that the old Confederates swore he was wearing out a liquor leg a week. The end.